Greetings and welcome to the first post-episode 200 edition of Zilog and Moto. I don't really know why 200 specifically was important or monumental. I mean, really, why is 200 any more important than, say, 147? But regardless of the why, it was something that I had circled on a calendar for a long time, and it felt really good to get there. But I'm not done. Not by a long shot, as I've still got well over 1,000 games left to review. So now that I've taken a brief break to celebrate and catch my breath, let's get right back to it. But what am I getting back to, you might ask, if you're not familiar with the channel? Well, about 5 years ago now, after watching videos of other retro gaming YouTubers, I had a thought. Why not me? What makes these guys so special that they can make videos and I can't? So I decided to start a channel based around my own collection and target what I felt like is an underrepresented segment on YouTube, especially in the United States, and focus on what I think of as the golden age of Sega consoles, basically from the Master System to the 32X, that whole 8 and 16-bit era from the late 80s and early 90s. Basically, if it was released for the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, or 32X, and I can read what's on the screen, I'm trying to obtain a copy of it and showcase the physical aspects of the package, the case and manual, and then actually play the game on original hardware, and then talk about if it was actually any good or not. For the Master System portion of the collection, when you were talking about the English language library of the console, chances are you're talking about a game that wasn't released originally in the United States, and instead made its appearance in PAL regions like Europe and Australia. And that is the case with today's game, which I was able to get in recently from France via eBay, and that is Winter Olympics. Winter Olympics goes by a few different names depending on which version you're talking about, but as you can see on the cover, Winter Olympics wasn't just referring to the Winter Olympics in general, like say Epic's Winter Games had before it. No, Winter Olympics in this case is actually a licensed property and was designed as a tie-in to the 1994 Olympics that took place in Lillehammer, Norway. The Olympics that year took place in February of '94, and because of that, the game had a timed release between December of 1993 and January of '94, depending on the region and the version. With it coming out that late in the console's lifespan, it makes sense that the Master System version only appeared in Europe and Brazil, the two locations where the console was still somewhat viable at that time. Along with that Master System version, US Gold took full advantage of the licensing rights to the Olympics that year and had versions of the game developed for the Amiga, DOS, and Super Nintendo, along with the Master System and Game Gear, and then finally the Genesis version that I covered back in episode 97. If you didn't see episode 97, I'll try to sum up the Genesis port of the game briefly. It sucks. Actually, let me be a little less brief. The Genesis port of Winter Olympics doesn't just suck, it's one of the worst games that I've reviewed since I started the channel. And I understand that some people are a little more sympathetic to it, but to me, it had absolutely horrendous controls, and there's just no coming back from that. If the game is utterly unplayable, it doesn't matter how good the rest of the game is, or the amount of megabits that it has, it's just trash. So having said that, I've got to be honest, this Master System version scares me a bit. I'm hopeful that this was developed by a different team at Tiertex, and it's not as bad, possibly bordering on passable, but this could be rough. So strap in and let's give the bobsled a go, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Winter Olympics, as I stated earlier, fresh in from France. I was a little concerned about it first when I ordered this, because it went through Hermes as part of the delivery cycle, but thankfully it made it to the International Distribution Center relatively quickly and in one piece. I had a few different copies to choose from on eBay, all similar in price, but I went ahead and chose this one, as I think the others might have had delivery issues to the United States or something. And just in case you're curious, that price is about $25 to $30 right now before shipping. This particular copy is in very nice shape, with just two things that I'll call out. The hang tab has been removed from the top of the case, and if you look close, there's an unfortunate scratch that runs down the back of the case, but thankfully isn't very deep. The manual and cartridge have held up extremely well, as we'll get to in a minute, and the Sega seal sticker that was used to show that the games were unopened from the factory is still intact, and I always like seeing those, as that was something that wasn't used in the United States. As far as the front cover goes, I like it for the most part, but there's one thing that just really irks me, and that's the placement of the Lilyhammer logo dead center of the graphics. Why put that logo there, out of all the places you could put it? Like, put it in a corner or dead center at the top and move some of the art, but this looks like they designed the cover, and at the last minute we're like, okay, well, the Olympics sent the graphics over, let's just be lazy and slap it right in the middle. It's too bad because it ruins what otherwise was some very nice artwork showcasing 3 of the included events. Also, quick note, there is an alternate version of this cover that Australia got, and rather than the Olympics logo, it has the Australian flag and the rings instead. No idea what happened there, especially since the Australian version has the Lilyhammer logo on the back of the package, so clearly they had the graphics available. At first I thought that maybe Australia didn't compete that year, but they did, and even won a bronze in short track speed skating, so your guess is as good as mine. Flipping over the back, and unfortunately this is one of those where you've got to have a magnifying glass to be able to read what's going on here. Assuming you can actually make it out, the flavor text is fine and mentions how the game features 10 events, which is nice, but it probably would have helped to have named some of them as well, rather than have players try to guess what's included based on the screenshots. Having said that though, the screenshots included are nice and show off 4 of those 10 events, looking like ski jumping, bobsled, biathlon, and maybe downhill slalom at the end. In fact, I'll be impressed if the game actually looks this good because it actually looks somewhat similar to the Genesis version here. Opening up the package, and you can see what I meant earlier when I said the manual and cartridge have held up well, with both appearing to be in mint condition. In fact, when I originally got this, there was cobwebs and a small, very dead spider in here, so clearly it hadn't been opened in some time. As far as the manual goes, it's got instructions in 8 languages, and thankfully they decided to dedicate sections of the manual to each language, rather than splitting the pages, like they sometimes do. Due to that, each language only has 8 pages to explain the game, which doesn't leave much room for graphics or screenshots, but there are a few included, and each of the events is explained, also with a bit of history about them, which I thought was a nice touch. Okay, that's the package. Let's go for the gold, and hopefully not relive that tragedy that was the Genesis version. Creating a video game that captures an event like the Olympics is a lot different than a standard sports game. If your game is based around baseball or football or soccer, you can put all your resources into just focusing on that one sport and build a game around that, where everything you do is constructed with the idea of just supporting playing that one specific sport. And that's not to say that sports games that only focus on one sport only play a certain way or only have one game mode. Frequently, baseball games will have a batting practice or home run derby mode, or soccer games might have a shootout mode. But both of those things aren't different than the game as a whole, they're just supporting one specific aspect of that game. For the Olympics, if you're going to make a title that references the games, it's expected that you're not just going to cover one particular sport. You're going to cover a wide variety of sports, with Electronic Arts Team USA Baseball being a notable exception, and arguably just a cash grab, but that's a different review. This, at least to me, makes the creation of the video game itself much more difficult, because now, rather than being able to focus all of the development team's efforts into one cohesive game with a singular goal, you're now having to essentially create sets of mini-games for each sport and connect all of them together via some sort of menu system or overall framework that the events sit in. This isn't an impossible task, though. Epix famously created the Games series in the mid-80s and served up more than a few titles of this nature, which provided multiple different types of events to play through without a central engine. And I'd say that they were successful for the most part, although titles like Summer Games 2, California Games 2, and World Games weren't quite as successful due to stretching the formula a bit thin. And with the Olympics, an event that literally has worldwide ramifications and attention as far as sports is concerned, being such a big deal, it only makes sense that companies would continue to at least attempt to try to take advantage of the licensing and notoriety potential of the event to try to make some money for themselves. The key word in that last sentence is attempt. Previously, I referenced the Genesis version of Winter Olympics that I reviewed back in episode 97 on the channel. If you haven't seen that video, well, you aren't missing much, as it's one of the thankfully limited number of games that I've reviewed so far that was so bad that I awarded it 0 stars. And to be clear, awarding 0 stars to a game is like that 5-star review that I just gave to Sonic 2 in the last episode. It's something that I'm going to avoid doing unless absolutely necessary, because there really shouldn't be that many games out there that are that bad, or that good. The Genesis version of Winter Olympics was bad for a number of reasons, but my main complaint was the controls, and the difficulty of the game that arose as a result of that. It seemed like that even when you played the game in easy, all of the computer opponents were significantly better than you, and didn't tend to make mistakes, offering you little hope of getting out of last place in any of the events, much less trying to get on the podium. The whole experience seemed to be an exercise in futility. I suppose if you were playing against a friend rather than the computer, it might be a bit more engaging, as you both were dealing with the same poor controls, but I can't imagine being bored enough to where that seemed like a good use of your time, especially with all of the other games out there. Going into this review, my hope was that even though this is a Master System title, which immediately means that it's going to be more limited graphically and sound-wise than the Genesis version, that perhaps the gameplay might have possibly been more of a focus due to those limitations, and the result was a game that, even though it was a scale down from a visual and audio standpoint, would still be a better game because it played better. Well, that was my hope anyway. It only took about 15 minutes to figure out that that wasn't the case, with Winter Olympics for the Master System actually being much more similar to the Genesis version than I'd expected. The overall setup to both versions of the game is the same, and actually something that I don't really have fault with. From the start of the game, you can choose to have one of 4 players, and then you can choose the sex, name, and country of each from a list of 16 countries. From there, you can either go into practice mode to take trial runs at each of the included 10 events, or perform in a mini Olympics where you can choose from which of the 10 events that you want to compete in, and then finally a full Olympic session consisting of all 10 events, complete with brief opening and closing ceremonies. In both Olympic modes, the computer will take on the role of each of the countries not chosen by players, leaving the player with a 16-way fight for the gold and overall medal count championship. I like everything about the setup here for the game, and I find it hard to actually think of a way to possibly improve on that setup, except for maybe more countries to choose from possibly. That's a fairly nitpicky thing though, and for the era, 16 is not too limited. Also, the game does have 3 difficulty modes that can be chosen in the option menu before you start up a competition, which should be another thing about the game. However, I should point out that all of my time playing the game was in the easiest difficulty, and it still just didn't even seem possible to compete against this computer in most events, so not sure how useful that option actually is, unless you just truly hate yourself. One thing that I would have added to the game if given the choice is the tracking of world records, due to their general importance in Olympic-type events. This is something that I think might be done in other versions of the game, but considering the aforementioned difficulty, players probably would never get close to those records anyway, so it's probably a moot point. So, what's going on with this game, and why is it so difficult? Well, the best way to talk about this is probably to break up the discussion into the different types of events. The game technically has 10 different events total, but they all fall into 6 categories. Skiing, which consists of downhill, Super G, giant slalom, and slalom. Moguls, ski jump, biathlon, short track speed skating, and finally bobsleigh and luge. Each of those categories of events has its own minigame engine that's tailored to that type of event, and of course each of those engines has a different control scheme. Let's start with skiing. Skiing actually has 3 different control methods for pointing the direction that your skier goes in, so that was nice of them to offer that flexibility. The problem is that even when you get used to one of them, they're all pretty touchy, and it's very easy to oversteer and get your skier pointed in the wrong direction. Keep in mind in these events, if you miss even one gate to ski through, you're disqualified, and if you actually try to take your time to make all your gates, you won't have a prayer of finishing with a podium level time. And to add insult to injury, the camera is far too close to the mountain, meaning that oftentimes you only have a split second to point yourself at the next gate, And that's assuming that you can even see it, because it might be off screen unless you happen to be in the perfect position on the track. I think with a bit of tweaking, they might have made this playable, but as it is, it's just frustrating. And I found myself more often than not skiing off into the trees to cut short runs rather than just have to make it all the way to the bottom of the mountain, where I knew I was going to be disqualified anyway. Next is a different type of skiing in moguls. Now, I'm going to be honest, I never figured this one out. Not when playing the Genesis version, and not now. The manual says you're supposed to press the opposite of the way the skier is moving, i.e. press left when the skier is going right and vice versa, and as you can imagine, that is awkward as hell. You're also supposed to be doing a few tricks during the run, and actually those were no problem to pull off, but without doing that first part right, you'll never be fast enough to compete. Moving on, there's the ski jump. In ski jump, the controls make sense. Press one button to jump, press the other to land, and keep your jumper straight by pressing left and right in the air. But even when I had what I felt were decent jumps, I was far short of anything that the computer was doing. I assumed that maybe with some practice I could have gotten better here, but as stated, I'm not real clear on what I was doing wrong. Then there's biathlon. Screw this event. Essentially, you have to alternate tap the two buttons to make the skier go down the course. For 6 minutes. Yes, I hope you like tapping buttons because you're going to be doing enough of it to get carpal tunnel. And the worst part is, it's unclear what's more important, speed or rhythm. Sometimes it seemed like I needed to go fast, and then sometimes it seemed like I needed to slow down and concentrate more on the taps themselves. Then, to add insult to injury, there's the shooting sections where you need to hit targets during the course, which provides a nice break from all the tapping, but unfortunately, your character cannot aim for crap, so chances are you're going to be missing shots and incur time penalties. My best run, I actually would have gold medaled by a considerable margin, but due to all of the missed shots, I finished in last. Again. Next is short track speed skating. Speed skating is another alternate tapping event, but thankfully, the race only lasts about 40 seconds. However, not only do you need to tap, but you need to somehow use the D-pad at the same time so that you don't run into the other skaters. Yeah, good luck. In the Genesis version, this event can be played simultaneously with other players, but that's been removed from the Master System version. No big loss. Finally, there's bobsleigh and luge. And at least in these modes, you do have a prayer of winning, if you figure out the secret. Do nothing. Well, that's not exactly true. You do need to lightly tap the controller to center your sled after turns, but other than that, the less you touch the controller, the better. Somehow, it's wildly ironic that the game mode where you have the best chance of winning are the ones where you do the least. But considering the rest of the game, it kind of makes sense. Both the graphics and sound in the game are better than what I was expecting. One of the reasons why I was originally so disappointed in the Genesis version was because it made sure to let you know that it was a 16 megabit cartridge, and the game just simply didn't look or sound that good, to the point where I was wondering where all that storage went. For the Master System version, the game weighs in at a hefty 4 megabits, and honestly, I think it compares very favorably with its big brother. The Genesis version does look and sound better, to be sure, but the gap isn't that large, and I think Tiertex did manage to do a good job with what they had available on the console, other than the aforementioned issues like the camera being too close in skiing events, which, and there's that word again, ironically, I think was done to try to make the game look better by showing more detail. I've already gone on way longer than I was planning for reviewing a port of a game that I already gave 0 stars to. But now I've got a decision to make. Is the Master System version just as unredeemable as the Genesis version, or should I give it some credit for running on 8-bit hardware in late 1993, early 94? This is a tough decision, believe it or not, but after some going back and forth, I decided to spare this version of the game the bomb rating and instead give it 1 star, with the caveat being that I still don't recommend playing this game at all, and I don't see myself ever playing it again personally. Okay, and that was Winter Olympics for the Master System. I mentioned that I'd only played the game briefly before realizing that this version of the game was really just more of the same from the Genesis version, But if I can say one positive thing about it, I did finally figure out how to properly play bobsleigh and luge, so I can't say that the game is completely impossible, just largely. I think my biggest feeling with the game is frustration, as in both versions of the game, there's a world where this is a fun title, as the framework for a good game based on the Winter Olympics is here. The execution is just off. Hopefully the next sports title will be a bit more engaging and not involve me wearing out the B and C buttons on my controller. Next time on Zilog and Moto, as far as that next sports game goes, we won't have to wait long to find out because I've got a sports title on the schedule for next week. Currently, we're in a bit of the doldrums as far as the professional sports world goes in the United States, with only baseball and soccer currently running. But that's only temporary because in a little over 2 months, one of my favorite sports seasons starts up again, and I'm hoping that the 1995 edition of this game will whet my appetite and tide me over a bit. We shall see. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 201. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.